Dual cab utes are more popular now than at any other point in history. And if you take a look at the sales charts, it's the tarted up variants that are really striking a chord with Australian customers. So here we have the newest variant of the Mazda BT50 taking on the country's most popular hay hauler, the Toyota Hilux. Now, one of the key areas that these utes have made up ground on the SUV is inside the cabin, and that's really notable in the Hilux. You've got a really good mix of materials, comfy seats, and the whole cabin itself is better thought out. There's soft touch padded materials on the centre console and on the door trims. The centre screen is really functional compared to some of the rivals, and even the instrumentation here in the instrument cluster is quite good. If I was to make one criticism, it's that everything you see here is reflected from the back window. Now, that was a problem of Holden Commodores in the 1990s. It probably shouldn't be on a modern dual cab ute. Now, in terms of storage and space, it is quite thought out. The rear seat is a little bit flat and there are no air vents, but overall, you really could make this work as an everyday functional truck. Now, like the Toyota, the Mazda is quite a contemporary space inside the cabin. There's plenty of room and a decent amount of storage as well. There are a couple of criticisms though. For one, it doesn't have the reach adjustment on the steering wheel, so you're not quite as comfortable in your driving position. The seats as well, they trade the cloth of the Hilux for leather. Again, they're supportive on longer journeys, but they're just not quite as well padded as what they could be. Other criticisms are probably in the centre fascia here, and the screen in particular. It's just a little bit aged and dated compared to the Hilux, and it's not quite as functional for that reason. One other point of difference between these two cars is the positioning of the reversing camera. So on the Hilux, you have it positioned in this centre screen here. It's really full of clarity, really clear picture. On the BT50 though, it's housed within this rear view mirror. So while it does raise your vision a bit and sort of encourages you to use the mirrors, it's not quite as clear and easy to see out of. If I was to make one other small criticism, the USB port in the Mazda BT50 is packaged away inside the glove box instead of being out inside the centre fascia, so it's just not quite as easy to use and live with. Now, that lack of change hasn't really mattered in terms of the way the BT50 drives, because it always has been and still is a really good, capable truck out on the road. I really like the calibration of this car's steering and suspension, but the star of the show has to be that 3.2 litre turbo diesel engine. It's a 5-cylinder, it's bigger in capacity than every other competitor in this class besides the Ranger, which shares the same underpinnings and architecture, but it's a really good thing. 147 kilowatts is plenty of punch out on the road, and with all that torque materialising from fairly down low in the rev count, it's a really easy car to build up to speed. And by the same token, it's quite effortless in both its towing and payload ability. The diesel engine is quite refined in comparison to the Hilux. It doesn't flare as much, it's a little bit quieter, and the note itself, it's more of a brute diesel engine note, almost like a truck, compared to smaller capacity 4-cylinder competitors. Now, like the Hilux, it does have a busy ride, but it is quicker to settle over small surface imperfections, meaning you're not getting that constant sort of juddering through the cabin. Being a leaf spring rear, it's not quite as settled as what you'd find in a traditional coil spring SUV, but out of all the dual cab utes, this one is right up there at the pointy end, just below Ford's Ranger, which is a little bit more finessed. As an overall package, the BT50 is a really polished performer out on the road. The diesel engine is fairly muted once you're up to speed, road noise is well contained when you're inside the cabin, and generally there's no squeaks or rattles. It is a really refined car out on the road. Now, the car we're driving has been fitted with the standard 6-speed manual transmission. It's a little bit rubbery, but also a little bit notchy through the gate, but the actual spread of ratios is really well spaced out, and the throw in the gearbox is good as well. It pretty much fits the description of a 2-ton ute. The Mazda has always been a pretty polished performer since this model was introduced 4 or 5 years ago. Now, unlike the Ranger, there haven't been any wholesale changes in this latest update introduced last year, but in saying that, it didn't really need any urgent overhauls, because the truck itself is really quite polished on the road. The steering has desirable sort of weighting and feedback through the wheel. The body is well controlled. The car itself feels pretty composed and planted on the road. Push the BT50 a little bit harder into a corner and you notice that can become a little bit flustered. But in saying that, it's pretty well suited to day-to-day duties. You notice the stability control calibration is really well done. And we've even had it on a few dirt roads, and even then it's sort of stayed poised and planted and all the systems work really well. The latest updates to the Hilux, introduced last year, have brought huge changes to the way that it drives. It used to have a fairly agricultural bent in both its engine calibration and also the way it steered and handled. It's a lot better than what it was. But in saying that, it's still not at the peak of this class. Even compared to the BT50, which is still sort of one rung down on both the Ford Ranger and the Volkswagen Amarok in terms of ride and handling, this car just feels a little bit as though it's lacking polish. The ride itself is fairly busy. Over small surface imperfections in particular, you notice that it just never really settles, and that's mostly evident when you're unladed in the rear. Add a little bit of weight, it does settle the ride massively, which is probably a pertinent point because a lot of people with these utes, particularly tradesmen, are going to have 300 or 400 kilos in the rear all the time. Now, interestingly, Toyota says that the suspension in both the SR5 and the SR, which comes one model down below, is exactly the same, which means the big difference is in the wheel size and the tyres. In the SR, it's a lot more settled in everyday driving, and you jump in this thing and straight away you notice it's just a lot busier in the rear. Not uncomfortable by any means, but you do notice it when you jump out of the Mazda and into this thing. As for the engine, yes, it is about 20 kilowatts down on the BT50, and you do notice it in everyday driving. The Toyota just doesn't have the same mid-range punch as the Mazda, and its engine is more prone to flaring, particularly once you put the hammer down. You sort of get that raucous diesel noise into the cabin. It's just not pushing along quite as hard as what the Mazda would be. In saying that though, the engine is a lot better than the predecessor, the old D4D 3-litre diesel. It's smaller in capacity and yet it's more efficient and offers more punch in acceleration. The other thing I've noticed is just the steering isn't quite as direct on the Toyota. It's a little bit more slack around the centre there, which could be good for towing and with a load in the back. And the body isn't quite well as controlled as the Mazda either. Just small things that means it lacks the finesse of its rival.